There's a person you've met maybe once, maybe 100 times, who you still can't quite explain. Not the best-looking person in the room, not the loudest, not the funniest, not the one working hardest to be noticed, and yet somehow, they were the one you remembered. Maybe it was someone at a party who barely said 10 words all night, but somehow you found yourself glancing over at them more than once. Maybe it was a coworker who never raised their voice in a meeting, and yet when they finally spoke, the whole room quieted down to listen. Maybe it was someone you dated once, briefly, years ago, who you still think about sometimes for reasons you've never been able to fully name. You've probably tried to describe it to someone else afterward. There was just something about them. And that sentence always trails off, because you don't actually know what the something was. Here's what's strange. You can meet someone who checks every box, attractive, successful, saying all the right things, and feel nothing. And you can meet someone who checks none of those boxes and feel like the room got a little smaller around them. What if that difference isn't random? What if it's not luck, or genetics, or some rare charm you either have or don't? Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this, not attraction as a performance. Attraction as a byproduct of something much deeper, something almost anyone could develop, but almost no one is taught. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that person in the room actually had, and more importantly, what's standing between you and having it too. Most of us have been trained to think of attraction as something you build from the outside in. Better clothes, better body, sharper stories to tell at dinner. A more polished version of your personality that you bring out for the occasion. So we perform. We monitor. In a conversation, some part of us is always running a second process in the background. How did that land? Was that too much? Should I have said it differently? It's exhausting. And most people never notice how exhausting it is, because they've never lived any other way. Think about the last time you walked into a room full of people you wanted to impress. A work event, maybe, or a first date, or a family gathering with relatives who always seem to have an opinion about your life. Notice how much of your attention went toward the actual moment, and how much went toward managing how you were coming across. For most people, it's not close. The managing wins. Over time, this creates a strange kind of fatigue. Not physical tiredness, the tiredness of never fully arriving anywhere, because part of you is always standing just outside yourself, watching, adjusting, running damage control on a version of you that hasn't even done anything wrong. Think about a first date. Somebody asks you a simple question, "What do you like to do on weekends?" And instead of just answering, some part of you is quietly editing. Is this answer interesting enough? Does it make me sound too boring? Too intense? Too available? Not available enough? By the time you actually speak, the sentence that comes out has already been through 5 rounds of revision. And the person across the table can feel that. Not consciously, but something in them senses the gap between the real answer and the managed one. More confidence tricks don't fix it. Neither does a better haircut, a gym routine, or a script for what to say when you meet someone new. Those things might change the surface for an evening, but they don't touch the actual problem, because the surface was never the problem. Here's a moment worth sitting with. If you feel more relaxed around people who don't matter to you than around the people who do, if family gatherings feel like a performance review while a conversation with a stranger on a plane feels effortless, that's not a coincidence. It's telling you exactly where the performing is happening and where it isn't. Jung would say the exhaustion isn't coming from other people's judgment. It's coming from somewhere much closer to home. He had a word for the process of becoming a whole person instead of a managed one. He called it individuation. It doesn't mean becoming more unique or more different from everyone else. It means something closer to the opposite, becoming fully, actually, yourself, instead of the edited version. You learn to show people somewhere along the way. To understand why that edited version exists, you need to understand 2 ideas Jung spent his life mapping: the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask you present to the world, the version of you built for work, for first impressions, for keeping the peace at Thanksgiving. It isn't a lie exactly. It's more like a costume that fits well enough that you forget you're wearing it. Everybody needs some version of a persona. The problem starts when the persona becomes the only version of you that gets any airtime, when the mask is doing so much work that the face underneath it starts to atrophy. The shadow is what the persona is quietly hiding. And here's the part most people get wrong. The shadow isn't the bad parts of you. That's the popular version, and it misses the point entirely. The shadow is whatever you've had to disown in order to be acceptable to your parents, your community, yourself. For some people, that's anger. For others, ambition, softness, need, jealousy, grief, even joy that felt too loud for the room they grew up in. Whatever got the message early on that it wasn't welcome gets pushed out of view. It doesn't disappear. It goes underground. Jung put it this way: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it's embodied in a person's conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes. The parts of yourself you refuse to look at don't shrink from being ignored. They just get louder somewhere you can't see them directly. Picture someone who was taught early that anger was dangerous. Maybe it caused chaos at home. Maybe it simply wasn't allowed. Maybe a parent's temper made the whole house go quiet and careful. That person grows into an adult who prides themselves on being easygoing, low drama, unbothered. Coworkers describe them as the calm one. On the surface, that looks like maturity. Look closer, though, and the anger usually hasn't vanished. It leaks out sideways in passive-aggressive comments they don't quite mean to make, in an exhaustion with no clear source, in a quiet resentment toward people who express anger openly and seem to get away with it. They might find themselves inexplicably annoyed at a friend who simply says, "That's not okay with me," in a moment of conflict, without realizing that annoyance is actually envy in disguise. That person isn't calm, they're managed, and other people can feel the difference, even without being able to name it. There's a stiffness around someone holding something back, a tension that reads, unconsciously, as hard to trust or hard to get close to, even when everything they're saying is perfectly reasonable. Now, picture the opposite, someone who's actually made peace with their own anger, not someone who's always angry, but someone who no longer needs to pretend it isn't there. They can say "that upset me" without flinching, without over-explaining it into nothing, without 3 follow-up sentences apologizing for having a reaction at all. There's an ease to them, and that ease is what people mean when they say, "there's just something about someone." A few patterns are worth naming here, because odds are you're living at least one of them right now. The first is fragmentation. Modern life rewards being a chameleon, one version of you at work, another with old friends, another with family, another online. Each version is calibrated to what that particular audience wants. The problem is, maintaining every mask costs energy, and none of them is fully you. Think of someone who's sharp and a little sarcastic with old friends, painfully formal and agreeable at work, and almost a different person entirely around their parents, still trying to be the child they were at 15. Ask that person who they actually are, underneath all 3 versions, and they might genuinely struggle to answer. People sense this, even unconsciously. Someone who's a different person in every room reads as slippery, even if each individual version of them is likable enough on its own. Compare that to someone who's roughly the same person with their boss as with their barista, polite in both places, but not performing in either. That consistency isn't a personality trait you're born with. It's the visible result of not having anything urgent left to hide. Then, there's projection. Jung noticed that whatever we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we tend to see, often magnified, in other people. If you've ever felt an outsized, almost irrational irritation at someone's confidence, or their bluntness, or their neediness, it's worth asking honestly whether that trait exists in you somewhere, unclaimed. Here's an example. Someone who was raised to be endlessly accommodating might feel a flash of contempt toward a coworker who says no to extra work without guilt. On the surface, it looks like judgment of the coworker. Underneath, it's often something closer to grief, a quiet mourning for the version of themselves that never learned that saying no was allowed. The people who irritate us most are frequently mirrors we don't want to look into. The same thing works in reverse with admiration. If you're endlessly drawn to a certain kind of person, the bold one, the free one, the one who doesn't seem to care what anyone thinks, that pull is often pointing straight at the part of yourself you haven't given permission to exist yet. It's not that you want them, it's that you want to be able to do what they're doing. There's also the repeating relationship. Notice if you tend to land in the same emotional dynamic with different people wearing different faces, the same kind of partner who needs saving, over and over, no matter how many times the last one didn't work out. The same kind of friend who takes more than they give, dressed up in a new name each time. Jung would say, these aren't bad luck. They're the unconscious circling back to the same unresolved material, hoping this time it gets addressed instead of repeated. Until the underlying pattern is actually seen, the cast changes, but the play stays exactly the same. And then there's the confusion this video opened, with mistaking charisma for presence. Charisma is built for an audience. It reads the room and gives people what they came for, and it works, genuinely works, in the moment. But it's a performance underneath, which means it needs an audience to exist at all. Turn the lights off, take away the crowd, and a purely charismatic person can feel strangely empty, almost unsure of who they are without someone watching. Presence doesn't need one. It's the same whether or not anyone's watching, because it was never built for anyone else's approval. That's the quieter quality that stays with people long after the charismatic performance has faded from memory. The friend who was just as steady on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as they were at the party, everyone still talks about. Most of us have spent years getting good at the version of ourselves built for other people, and almost no time with the version that exists when no one's watching. It shows, not in some obvious way, but in that faint sense certain people give off of never quite being reachable, never quite still, always half a step removed from the actual moment they're standing in. If hiding is what dulls presence, integration is what restores it. Jung was specific about what that actually involves. It isn't a mood you stumble into on a good day. It's 3 deliberate movements, and each one takes real effort. The first is awareness, actually catching the pattern instead of living inside it unconsciously. That means noticing, in the moment. I just softened what I think because I was worried how it would land, instead of noticing it hours later, lying awake, replaying the conversation, if you notice it at all. This sounds small, but it's genuinely difficult, because most of these patterns were built specifically to run without your attention. A useful place to start is simply asking, after any conversation that left you feeling slightly off, what did I not say? What did I edit out before it reached my mouth? The answer is usually more revealing than anything that was actually said out loud. The second is acceptance, and it's the part most people skip, because acceptance gets confused with approval. Accepting your jealousy doesn't mean deciding jealousy is a virtue you should lean into. It means no longer treating its existence as proof that you're broken. You can look directly at a trait you don't love and just let it be true, without handing down a verdict on the spot. Imagine someone who catches themselves feeling a stab of jealousy when a friend gets promoted. The instinct is usually to bury that feeling immediately, maybe even to overcompensate with exaggerated congratulations to prove to themselves they're not the kind of person who feels that way. Acceptance looks different. It looks like quietly acknowledging, I feel jealous, and that doesn't make me a bad friend. It makes me someone who also wants that for myself, and then congratulating the friend anyway, honestly, because the jealousy has been met instead of denied. The third is integration, letting the accepted trait actually shape how you live, instead of leaking out sideways in ways you didn't choose. Someone who integrates their anger doesn't become someone who yells more. They become someone who can say no cleanly the first time, instead of saying yes resentfully 6 times before exploding on the 7th time over something completely unrelated. The energy gets used on purpose, instead of escaping sideways into sarcasm, silence, or a slammed cabinet door that was never really about the cabinet. This is where the idea of being magnetic actually earns its meaning, not through mystery or manipulation, but through the specific relief people feel around someone who isn't fighting themselves. We tend to relax around people whose nervous systems aren't at war, because it gives our own nervous system a kind of unspoken permission to relax too. You can feel this in a waiting room, in a tense meeting. Even in an argument, the presence of one settled person changes the temperature of the entire space. None of this happens overnight, and it's worth saying plainly, nobody finishes this work. Jung was clear that individuation isn't an event, it's closer to a discipline, something closer to physical training than a single insight you have once and then carry forever. But the direction matters more than the speed. Someone 6 months into honestly meeting their own shadow is already noticeably different to be around than someone who's spent 6 more years perfecting how they manage theirs. So what does the other side of this actually feel like, from the inside, on an ordinary day, rather than in some dramatic moment of breakthrough? Quieter, not because life gets less complicated, but because the background process, the constant monitoring, the adjusting, finally gets some rest. You walk into a room, and there's simply less to track, because you're not running an edited version of yourself for approval at the same time as actually being there. You notice it in small moments. Someone asks a question you'd normally deflect, and instead you just answer it plainly, and nothing terrible happens. You disagree with someone you respect, and instead of immediately backpedaling, you let the disagreement sit there, uncomfortable but honest. You spend an evening alone, and instead of feeling like you're missing something, you feel like you're simply with yourself, which turns out to be enough. Relationships change too, and not always the way people expect. Some people who couldn't tolerate the honesty drift away, and that stings, especially at first. That's not a failure, though. That's the filtering working correctly. The ones who stay because they're responding to something real, not a performance they'll eventually see through and resent you for maintaining. There's a particular aliveness in this that's hard to describe until you've felt it. The aliveness of saying what you actually think in a meeting and discovering the room didn't collapse. Of admitting to a want you used to be ashamed of and finding it doesn't make you smaller in anyone's eyes, least of all your own. Of sitting in silence with someone without needing to fill it because the silence stopped being threatening and started being simply comfortable. This is what Jung meant by wholeness, not perfection, not having resolved every difficult thing about yourself once and for all. Wholeness just means nothing essential about you is being hidden from view anymore, including from your own view that the version of you at work, the version at home, and the version alone at night are close enough to the same person that you're not exhausting yourself keeping them apart. And a person who's no longer fighting themselves is, without performing at all, magnetic. Not because it was built to be, because it's rare, and because people can feel, almost immediately, the difference between someone managing an image and someone who's simply stopped needing one. So here's the reframe worth carrying with you. The goal was never to become more attractive. That was always a symptom, not the destination. The real goal, the one Jung spent his life mapping, was to stop being at war with yourself long enough to find out who was underneath the war the whole time. Before you go, sit with one question honestly, without rushing to answer it. What part of yourself have you spent years managing instead of actually meeting? You don't need the answer today. Jung would say the question itself is where the work begins, and the work, done slowly and honestly, is its own kind of return.